Hello. Well, Nina came by a couple of days ago just to see how the old folks were doing with this quarantining and social distancing, and she wanted to make sure we was all right, and we were just fine. And we got to talking, and we were discussing about the state of the world at this particular moment in time. And she said, Pete, you really need to share the story of the time you first saw an African. I said, you remember that story? She says, yes, I do. And I think you need to share it. I think you need to share it with others. Well, I have told it from time to time because I've been involved in public speaking for most of my working career. But maybe she's right. Maybe it is time to tell the story once again. So here it is. I was born in the United Kingdom, and it really was a kingdom because we had a king, King George VI. And he wasn't just a king, he was an emperor because he ruled over what was once known as the British Empire. He ruled over many peoples of many different colours, many different religions, people of all shapes, sizes and colours. But I knew nothing of this because I was just living in a very small community somewhere many miles west of London. And everywhere I went, I saw white people. I had my family, I had my friends, and we had our neighbours. And we were all white. It was just very white. But there came a day when my parents took me out, and I don't know where we had been, but I remember we were coming back from wherever it was, and we was at a station waiting for a train. And my mother was holding me tightly by my hand so I wouldn't run away or even fall and hurt myself. She was holding me tightly, and she bent her head down to me and she said, Peter, look, Daddy's talking to a black man. Well, I looked along the platform the way she indicated, and sure enough, my father was talking to a man who was black. I'd never seen an African before, but that's what he was. He was an African. But I didn't know that until much later when my parents told me. He was just a black man. He was very well dressed. He had a three-piece suit on. It was pinstripe, blue pinstripe suit. Three-piece. And he was gigantic. Oh my God, he was gigantic. My father was 5'2", and this man was towering over him. And he was also big. He had a big barrel chest, and you could tell that he was very powerful and muscular. And I just stared and stared. Now my mother, under normal circumstances, would have told me that it's very rude to stare at people, and she would have stopped. But on this occasion, she let me just drink the sight in. And I looked and looked at this African talking to my father, overawed at the sight. As he spoke, he was gesticulating, and I noticed that the palms of his hands were so wonderfully pink. My hands weren't pink like that, but he had such pink palms, you know, the colour of little babies that I'd seen. And then he had short curly hair cut close, and so different. And I stared and I stared, and all at once he realised that he was being watched by me, and he looked my way and he smiled. He smiled at this little child who was staring at him. And to this day, when he smiled, to this day, I have never seen teeth so even and so white. Oh my gosh. I couldn't imagine where this man had come from. Could not imagine, but I couldn't take my eyes off him. I don't know whether this was arranged or whether it was by accident, but when we got on the train, we shared the same carriage. And this gentleman, he sat with his back to the engine. It was a steam, there's all steam trains back then, of course. And he sat with his back to the engine. I sat in my mother's lap and opposite, Dad next to us. And he and Dad were talking. I don't know what they spoke about, but I remember his voice being deep and very, very kind of musical. And every once in a while he'd catch me still staring at him, and he would grin and smile at me. And then all at once he reached out with those wonderful pink palmed hands, and he reached out for me, and my mother placed me in his arms, and he held me, and he shook me and rocked me, and then he lifted me up and rocked me in the air and bounced me up and down, and I giggled and I laughed, and then he too laughed. And I've never again heard a laugh like it. It was a deep rumbling sound. It must have come all the way up from his heels. It came out that chest, and it was just a wonderful bubbly laughter, and it just got really loud, you know, filled the carriage with laughter as he toyed with this little child. Then he gave me back to my mother, and she sat me in her lap, and he and my father continued their conversations. I wanted him to stay with us. I wanted to take him home. But the train pulled into the station and he left, and we had another stop to make, and we journeyed on. Never forgot that. Never forgot that wonderful, wonderful moment when I met that African. Several years later, I went on a shopping expedition with my mother. I always liked to go shopping with my mother, because as a child, because if I was a good boy and I didn't misbehave, she would always end the shopping trip with a visit to the toy store, and she would buy me some kind of little toy, you know, to make me happy, just because she loved me. And I remember we was on the bus, and again my mother being a very good mum, she let me sit next to the window so I could see everything. So I'm sitting next to the window on the bus, and I looked out the window, and there was a lady standing just a little bit apart from 2 or 3 other ladies. I've never seen a lady like this one. And she was dressed in a sari. She had this silk shawl over her head, and she had a red dot in the middle of her forehead, and her skin was coffee coloured, chocolatey coloured, and she had a bare midriff because that's a sari. And the English weather, you know, doesn't lend itself to people wearing saris, but she was wearing a sari. And I nudged my mother. I said, "Mum, look at that lady." And Mum could have said any kind of negative thing. She could have said anything negative that she could have thought of, but she couldn't think of negative things because that wasn't my mother. She bent down to my ear and she said to me, I never forget these words, she said to me, she said, "Oh Peter, isn't she beautiful?" Because at that moment my mother wanted to teach me that when I saw people of a different race, different nationality, I should always look for the beauty. I should always look for the beauty in people. Look for the interest in their customs and their traditions. I should always approach people as they did with that African gentleman. I should always show an interest and try to learn from them and make friends with them, make them feel welcomed. And above all else, I should always give people the opportunity to show kindness to me. That's the lessons that I learnt from my mother. And I think maybe it's a good lesson for all of us. There it is, my first African and my first Indian.